First of all, I wanted to ask you a question, or I want you to think about a question. Um, the question is, what is a business analyst for? I'm going to give you a couple of possibilities. Is a business analyst there in order to get stuff done inside the organization? That's the first option. So option number one. Or are they there in order to help the organization to do the right things by thinking about things the right way? So that's the second option. Now, if you feel like it, you can put your answer in the chat window, and then we'll be able to see what you think. I mean, I've got a fairly good idea what you're probably going to say. Yes. Yes, when I gave this talk at the conference earlier in the autumn, there was one person who said option number one in answer to that question, which I thought was quite brave. And yeah, I like that. I like the contrarian view because that's what I always find myself giving in these talks. I'm always telling people to re-examine their assumptions and re-examine their basic ideas about the way they do business analysis. But yeah, I think a business analyst is there to help the organization think really. Um, and I'm sure this lady would agree. Here's the definition of a business analyst or business analysis from the book entitled Business Analysis, published by BCS. Business analysis is an advisory role that carries out services in order to ensure the effective deployment of business changes and use of technology in line with the needs of an organization. So it's an advisory role. It's not an executive role. It's not about making those decisions. It's about ensuring that people have got the right information to make the right decisions. Um, okay, so yeah, we're talking about the Cheshire Cat and the entrepreneurial BA. Why are we talking about the Cheshire Cat? Um, you may very well have read this book that this illustration is from, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. If you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. It was written in 1865 by Lewis Carroll, who was a maths lecturer at Oxford University, and he made up this story for a little girl that was a family friend. Um, who's called Alice, and the story is about a little girl called Alice. She she's chilling out by the side of the river one afternoon, and she falls down a rabbit hole. And after she's fallen right down to the bottom of the rabbit hole, she finds herself in a very strange world, which is like a parallel dimension. Um, and all sorts of strange things happen to her there. She meets all sort of strange characters, um, and she's walking along, and she's going along next to this forest, and she comes across this strange creature who is sitting in a tree. It's a cat with a very large smile, and this is called the Cheshire Cat. I'm not sure why it's called the Cheshire Cat, but it's called the Cheshire Cat. She says to the Cheshire Cat, "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" And the Cheshire Cat says, "Well, that depends a good deal on where you want to get to. So the next step that you take, the direction that you go in, needs to be taken in accordance with where you want to get to at the end." So Alice then says, "I don't much care where I get to." Um, and the answer from the Cheshire Cat is, then it doesn't much matter which way you go. Uh, and yeah, how many, yeah, as long as I get somewhere, she says. how many times have you dealt with business stakeholders who seem to be taking this attitude? They want to get somewhere, but they don't really seem to care where it is. They just want to be able to show some progress. Um, yeah, you're sure to do that. You're sure to get somewhere. You're sure to get somewhere in the end. The question is, are you going to get to the are you going to get to the right place? So that's not really very helpful. She wants to know how she's going to get out of this strange world that she's found herself in. The Cheshire Cat doesn't really answer her question. Um, so she goes on her way, and the Cheshire Cat just dissolves, and nothing is left of the Cheshire Cat but its big smile sitting on the branch. So I was thinking of that when I saw this graphic um, on LinkedIn a while ago. You might have seen this graphic on LinkedIn a while ago from IIBA, and it shows supposedly how to perform gap analysis. Um, it's a journey. It's shown as a journey, and although this is a long and winding road, as the song goes, it's a road. It's a line. It's not a straight line, but it's a line. There's no turnings. Now, when I look at this, I think, okay, it's a linear process and it's a linear way of thinking. What have you got to do? Well, you've got to, define the current state, define the future state, identify the gap, prioritize the gaps, document your recommendations, etc., etc., monitor and evaluate. Easy, right? Um, it makes it look kind of straightforward. And Um, if we boil it right down, this is what we're talking about. And you've probably seen things rather like this. You may even have drawn diagrams rather like this yourself. Um, you've got two things. You've got an as is situation. That's the current state. So that's what's currently going on in the organization. And we've got a target state. That's what we often call the to be state. And we might use these words if we're talking about business processes. We might use them if we're talking about IT systems or whatever else, skills and so on. And for some reason, the current state is always on the left, and the target state is always on the right. And there's a line going from the left to the right, and there's an arrow. Uh, and when we see a line with an arrow going from the left to the right, there's several things that makes us think. Firstly, um, this happens before that. The as is happens before the target state. Well, that makes sense. Obviously, the current state is in the present. The target state is in the future. It also implies that if you do something over here on the left, it's going to result in something that happens over here on the right. So it's not just about chronology, when things are, it's also about causation, maybe. Doing something over there on the left will lead to something on the right. Um, but also, you can think about it another way, and I think part of what we feel when we see a diagram like this is that there is a dependency as well. So if you want to get to the state that's on the right, you have to be on the left to begin with, and you have to go along a certain route from the left to the right. So it's got a kind of feeling of inevitability about it. As soon as we think about going from the current state to the target state via a certain path, um, that tends to close down our thinking a little bit, and we just assume, yes, we go through this sequence of steps. We know what's going to happen. We do this, 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 and then this will happen. It's a no-brainer. Um, and these ideas of the as is state and the to be state are really baked into the way that we tend to think about business analysis. I think they're very sort of fundamental ideas that we tend to take for granted. Um, but there are questions. There are questions. Firstly, what is the current state? Obviously, for business analysts, that's a very key question. What is the current state? So, if you look at your organization, think about the forest that Alice is walking through in the book. What is the current state of that forest? What's the current state of this forest that you see on the slide? Well, you might say, oh, it's an autumn forest. And yeah, it is an autumn forest. But it's kind of impossible to answer the question. There's thousands of trees in that forest. Each of those trees has got thousands of leaves on it. There's thousands of insects. There's thousands of other small animals. There's loads of birds. There are spores in the ground, um, fungal organisms, mollusks, you name it. No, and that's not even talking about what's in the water. Goodness knows what kind of organisms there are in there as well. So um, it's impossible to summarize what is the current state of that forest. And your organization is really no different. Whether your organization employs 100 people or it employs 1,000 people or it employs 10,000 people, it's very, very complex. Each of those individuals is complex enough on their own. So if you wanted to describe it fully, you'd be there forever. The only reason why we think it's appropriate to try and describe the current state of our organization is that we're focusing on one particular aspect of it at a time. And we're trying to summarize that particular aspect, that particular perspective on the organization by saying this is the current state. So the question is, how do we know that's the right aspect? However much we may think we're taking a holistic view, we are generally focusing on one aspect. The reason we think we know it's the right aspect is, of course, that someone's asked us to look at that particular aspect. That's the aspect that we've been asked to look at. Um, so we've got a project sponsor, or we've got a client, or whoever it is that has asked us to do the work in the first place. But in my experience, I think if there's one thing that I've learned from about business analysis, from doing it as a consultant for well over 30 years, the thing that the customer asks you to focus on is usually the wrong thing. I mean, it's almost always the wrong thing. It's part of the right thing, or it's just completely the wrong thing. Um, there's always has to be this process of standing back and trying to get them to draw back from the subject, and refocus on something slightly different. Maybe take a wider lens to look at the whole picture. Um, so that's an interesting one. Um, that is an interesting one. How do we deal with this kind of complexity? There's some tools that we can use. I mean, this is a tool that I really like. That a lot of you will be very familiar with. This is the idea of a resource audit. It's an incredibly simple idea, but I find it really powerful. Um, if you look at a resource audit as described in the BCS book that I referred to earlier, there are 5 categories of resources listed on there. The one that I've added in here is relationships. I normally add that one in because I think it's the relationships that we have within an organization and the relationships that the organization has with external entities that are, often the most important resources that the organization has. Um, between people, between organizational units, those interrelationships, because an organization is a system, um, and in any system, it's the interrelationships between the parts that give rise to the emergent behavior of the system. Um, so yeah, we can use tools like that, and that is helpful. Um, But I think coming back to the idea of gap analysis, gap analysis to me, it's a profoundly kind of negative term. Gap analysis is about there being something missing. And another thing that I've become more and more convinced of over the years is that the way that people talk about the situation or the assignment, the business analysis assignment, the way that they talk about the situation right from the word go has an incredibly powerful effect. Um, so psychologists sometimes talk about anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is where you're maybe you're negotiating about the price of something, and that first number that someone says in that negotiation has an incredibly powerful effect on the subsequent uh, progress of that negotiation, and you end up somewhere different depending on where you started. Another word that psychologists use for this effect, which I like a lot, and I, talk about a lot, is framing. It's the framing effect. So when you talk about the situation as if there is a problem there, you're putting the situation in the frame of there being a problem. Another thing that you're doing is you are actually putting a frame around the situation in terms of saying, what is important in this situation, what's within the scope of what we're talking about, and what's not within the scope of what we're talking about. Um, and that's why it's so incredibly important, those early stages of a piece of business analysis work, where you still have a little bit of opportunity to shape that frame and say what's within the scope and what's um, not part of the scope. So if you talk about the situation as if there's a problem there, people will think there's a problem there, and they will start to view the situation as a problem that's got to be solved. And that's the mindset that we very often have as business analysts. We assume there is a problem to be solved. Otherwise, why would we be doing the work? So, saying there's a problem to be solved implies there's something wrong, there's something deficient or defective in the situation. There's another approach that I really like, which is not so familiar to business analysts generally, which is called appreciative inquiry. And it's really summed up in this little drawing. I don't know if you've come across appreciative inquiry, but um, if you haven't, then look it up. But it's a very, very simple idea. The basic idea is very simple. It's what it says in the picture. Instead of saying, what are we doing wrong? uh, Say, what are we doing right? So it's about talking to the different stakeholders in this situation at the beginning of your work and getting them to tell you stories about, why they think this place is great, what makes us proud about working here, what are the things we've done um, personally in the past that have made us feel good. Everyone will have stories like that. In every organization, people will have stories like that. And in appreciative inquiry, instead of focusing on trying to solve a problem or fix something that's wrong, you're trying to grow your ideas from an improved situation from those stories. The stories are like the sort of mulch that you have on the floor of the forest that's made up of the leaves that have come off the trees, and your new system will grow like a tree in the forest. That's the idea. So ultimately, you're doing much the same sort of thing. You're still doing analysis, you're still doing design and so on, but you're doing it with a different mindset. You're doing it through a different frame, and therefore you may get very different results. Um, Particularly because the people will be feeling differently about the whole situation, and it's the way that people feel about the situation that we sometimes tend to overlook, but it's incredibly influential. So that's a couple of things about the current state, the as is state. Um, yeah, then there's the target state. The target state is even more problematic. This is even more difficult. Of course, what is the target state? What's the target state going to be? Um, and coming back to gap analysis, I was doing some research about this. I was trying to work out, well, where does this idea of gap analysis come from? Why do we talk about it? And it seems, I mean, I may be missing something, but it seems that the first influential person that talked about it was Russell Ackoff, who some of you will have come across if you're interested in systems thinking. He was very, very influential in systems thinking through decades, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. He wrote loads of books. Really interesting guy. Definitely, he's worth looking up as well. And he had this idea of what he called idealized design. This is his process for idealized design, which we won't go through in detail because we don't have time. But you basically start off when you're doing idealized design by saying, imagine you come into work one day and the system that you use, the business system and or the IT system, whatever it is, it's gone. It's burnt down. It's not there anymore. There's nothing left. You've just got a blank sheet of paper. You've got to start from nothing. So you've now got an opportunity. You've got an opportunity to create something that completely makes sense. It's good. It's got none of those stupid workarounds we all have to deal with in the current state. It's got none of those gaps, got none of those problems. So we can design something that's logical, it's efficient, it's effective. Sounds really good. And it is really good, particularly if you've got a greenfield sort of situation. So when I've worked with startup type organizations in the past, that's what I've been able to do, work with the stakeholders to design something that makes complete sense. The information systems are completely integrated, there's no duplication, etc., etc. Um, so, of course, in most organizations, that's not what you've got. You don't have a blank sheet of paper. You've got to start from where you're starting from. So you've got to say, okay, well, what are the gaps? That's where this idea of gap analysis comes from, I think. Um, so what can we do in order to get from where we are now to our ideal state? And that's where you get the definition of a project that you're going to do from. Um, so that's the way of thinking that really underlies the approach to business analysis practice that's described in the BCS book again. Um, and this sort of linear way of thinking helps you a lot in some situations. One type of situation that it really helps you in is if you're trying to get stuff done. So if you're managing a project, for example, you might use this way of thinking that's shown on the slide. It's some people call this a PERT chart, some people call it a CPM chart. It shows what you've got to do in order to get your project done by the end date. So you start writing it and you start reading it at the right hand side. You say, okay, what we want to get to is completing the project. Now, in order to complete the project, we need to get tasks 1, 2, and 3 done. In order to get task 1 done, we need to get task 4 done. In order to get task 2 done, we need to get task 6 and 5 done, etc. Um, so it shows you what you need to do and what are the dependencies between the tasks. And to me, this is the single most useful tool for managing a project. It's very valuable. Um, and there's something else that business analysts use, which I think it looks very similar. And I've drawn this picture deliberately so that it looks very similar to the other one. It's a benefits map, or it's showing the shape of a benefits map. So here you're saying, what are the benefits we're trying to get from this project? Um, and you just use a logical chain of thinking to say, in order to get that benefit, we need to make these changes, business changes 1, 2, and 3. And in order to make those 3 business changes, we need to make these so-called enabling changes, changes 4 and 5, and so on. So this again, I find this a really fantastic tool. It's really, really powerful. Um, But it does kind of assume that you've already got agreement on what it is that you're trying to do. You can use this to have a conversation about that. Um, but the nature of the diagram assumes that you already know what it is that you're trying to do. And going hand in hand with these types of approaches, you can take a top-down hierarchical approach to decomposing the work that has to be done. So if you're familiar with Prince 2, for example, you'll be familiar with product breakdown structures and work breakdown structures. You decompose the outputs that you need to create in your project in this hierarchical way, and from that you generate a hierarchical model of the work that you need to do in order to create those outputs. Great. So, bottom line, working backwards is great if you want to get something done and you know what that thing is. And I would add to that, uh, as long as you're sure that that is the thing you want to get done, and your opinion about that isn't going to change over the course of the project. So the external environment or the internal environment isn't going to change in such a way that you might wish you had set off in a different direction in the first place. Um, because that's the thing about projects. Once you've set up a project and you've said this is the outcome that we want at the end, and this is where we are at the beginning, you've gone through all this rigmarole of getting resources for the project, making a plan for the project, getting people, getting stakeholders into specific roles related to the project, and so on. um, it's very hard then to step back from that mindset. It's very hard to look outside that frame and say, actually, maybe we should be going in a different direction. And that's one of the things that I like about the agile approach. It encourages you to do that, but it is difficult, and it requires an awful lot of sort of effective communication with stakeholders, really. So what if you're not sure what it is that you want? What you're not sure what the target state is? Um, well, one thing about this is I'm very interested in design. If you've been to any of my talks before, you'll know I'm always going on about design. So this guy, Herb Simon, another really influential person, he wrote a very important book called The Sciences of the Artificial. This is going way back to the 1960s. He was an economist. He was one of the pioneers of artificial intelligence, actually. He did all sorts of interesting stuff. And this is one of his things that he said: everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. Um, so that's exactly what we've been talking about, isn't it? Changing existing situations, i.e., the as is situation, into preferred ones, i.e., the to be situation. So if you want to do that as a business analyst or as an organization, I think it's helpful to think about yourself as a designer, which is a little bit alien for some business analysts. Um, and I tend to find the process of design is squiggly. So this squiggle picture, was done by Damien Newman, who is a designer, and he drew this drawing, which has kind of gone viral over the last 20 years. You've probably seen it somewhere. And I put this in because I was in a workshop quite recently at a conference, and I had to sit down with a couple of other people in a little group, sitting really close to each other, and we had to talk about ourselves to each other. That's kind of really scary stuff. We had to tell each other about ourselves, and one of them got talking about careers, and she said, "I've had a kind of squiggly career," and the other guy said, "Yes, I've had a squiggly career as well." And I realized that the mental model that they both had was that your career can start off like this, like a really a mess, like a ball of wool or a bowl of spaghetti. It's all over the place. But then what you want to do is, as your career progresses, you want it to flatten out and converge on a nice straight line. Um, that's the sort of mental model that they seem to have. So even though this picture is supposed to describe a design process, actually it describes this idea of a squiggly career as well. And it's kind of suggesting that the second half of your career is going to be completely straightforward, which is perhaps not always the case. So at the end of this session at the conference, the facilitator said to us, okay, now I want you each to tell each other in the group, I want you to say what is the thing you really value about that person, which was pretty weird considering we'd only just met each other. Um, Particularly hard for British people, I feel. Um, anyway, when we've been talking about careers earlier, I said, well, I haven't really had a squiggly career. I've had more of a branching career. Um, because I started off as a software developer. I did that for a couple of years, but then over the decades since then, I've done lots and lots and lots of different things, more and more different things. So I haven't had a squiggly career. I've had a branching career. So you can see this picture is basically the opposite of the squiggly picture. So that's what I said to those people. And at the end of the session, they said, the gift that you gave us was when you talked about a branching career rather than a squiggly career. And that's what we valued. So I was amazed because it was just a word that I said, but it really resonated with both these people. Um, but this is the sort of difference that we're talking about here with things like appreciative inquiry. We're just looking at the same situation, but looking at it in a different way, looking at it kind of down the other end of the telescope, so to speak. Um, so what we're saying here is instead of how can we get to a fixed point in the future, we're saying what are the multiple points in the future that we might want to get to? And how can we organize things so that we've always got the option of going to different points at different times? So it's about having options. Um, so the reason why this talk is called the Entrepreneurial BA is because of this lady, Sarah Sarasvati. And I only came across her work this year. I'd never heard of her before. She's an academic. She's written a couple of books and loads of papers. And the main area of study for her is entrepreneurs. She's devoted a lot of time and effort to studying entrepreneurs, and in her work, which I recommend you have a look at, but I'm going to summarize some of the basic ideas for you. She says there are three types of uncertainty in business. Um, Firstly, you've got a situation where the future is driven by highly predictable factors. So it's a very straightforward situation. Um, the second type of situation, the future is driven by phenomena which are highly unpredictable, but they can be studied in a systematic way through testing and experimentation, about which reliable expertise can be developed over time. Again, recognizable as describing quite a lot of the situations that we deal with. And then a third type of uncertainty, the future is driven primarily by human action, which is intrinsically unpredictable and not susceptible to measurement. Well, that also describes a lot of the uncertainty that we have in projects and in organizations, doesn't it? So these three types of uncertainty are all relevant to us as BAs. Um, and her advice is basically you need to recognize the sort of situation that you're in because you need to deal with them in different ways. So if it's the first type, what you need to do is predict the future in order to make rational decisions, seek detailed and systematic information and analyze it to achieve the relevant goals. And business analysts, we like it. We like it if we're in that situation because it's straightforward, we can control it, and we know what's going on. We know we're going to be right. But how many situations are we in that are actually fully described by this type of uncertainty? The second one, um, make predictions and refine them through iterative learning. So again, this is what agile is about to some extent, isn't it? It's about testing, experimentation, um, and or consulting with experts. And then the third type of uncertainty, this is the most surprising one, really. How do you deal with this sort of uncertainty? Develop intuition through up close and personal observation combined with induction. So, induction is basically drawing generalized conclusions from individual situations um, about relevant human agents, um, and to build stakeholder partnerships and consensus among them with a view to controlling and shaping the future rather than trying to predict it. Um, so, as I said, she's all about entrepreneurs. She studies entrepreneurs, and basically, she's found that successful entrepreneurs work in a different way from the rest of us. I mean, I did try being an entrepreneur at one point, but it didn't really work out. So, um, yeah, a view to controlling and shaping the future rather than trying to predict it. So she goes from that to saying there's three sorts of reasoning. Um, three sorts of reasoning. The first one is causal reasoning, which is based on the idea that if you want to achieve a particular thing, there will be certain causal factors that give rise to it. Or if there's an undesirable outcome you want to avoid, you still got to look at the causal factors, just like we do with fishbone diagrams and things like that. So you've got a predefined goal. Um, Maybe there are several alternative means, like we see here, M1, M2, M3, M4, different ways you can achieve it. All you've got to do really is choose the right one. So this is the kind of classic systems analysis from the 1950s and 60s, or operations research. Um, Strategic reasoning, um, a bit more complicated, but not much. Strategic reasoning, you've got multiple goals. So, if you're running a business, you've got multiple goals and you've got some given means, M1 and M2, and maybe you've got to invent some new means, M3 and M4, um, ways of getting to those goals. You might need to develop new capabilities as an organization, but it's basically the same sort of thing. But what she found is that generally entrepreneurs do not think using strategic reasoning or causal reasoning. They think using what she called effectual reasoning, because an effect is the opposite of a cause. What they say is, what's the situation? What have I got going for me? What's my resource audit, if you like? What what are the relationships that I've got? What are the strong points that I've got? What are the dispositions of the system, if I can put it that way? What are the characteristics of this human activity system that's going on at the moment that mean it's good at doing some sorts of things and bad at doing some other sorts of things? And then what can I do with that? Where can I go from there? Um, so it's a process not just of choosing the means that you use, but it's a process of choosing where you want to go to on the basis of what you've got going for you at the moment. That's what entrepreneurs do. And that has something in common with the idea of appreciative inquiry, where where you go to is very much rooted in where you're starting from at the moment. So um, So contrasting those two logics, the causal logic, this is basically what we all take for granted is the normal way of thinking as business analysts. We start with the goal we want to focus on, or what the business should focus on, the expected return, the financial return, or whatever other benefits. Maybe you analyze the competition. You plan, you predict, you avoid surprises, you nail everything down, you do your analysis work, and hopefully you find opportunities. So she was not setting out to describe business analysts. But when I read this, I thought, you know what, this whole mindset is very much what we do as business analysts. But the other type of logic she calls effectual logic, where you don't start with the goals, you start with the means. What can we do here? What have we got that we can use instead of focusing on our expected return? She found that entrepreneurs don't do that. They just know their level of affordable loss and they don't waste any time doing great calculations about what return on investment they're going to get. They just say, if I reach such and such a level of loss, I'm pulling out of this, and then they just get on with it. Um, but it's a different mindset. Instead of analyzing the competition, you grow a network of partnerships. And I think what's interesting here is this is something that can be useful not just at the organizational level, but for us as individuals as well. So, that's why I put in the title the Entrepreneurial BA, because we can think about this um, from our own individual point of view as well. Um, it, Instead of trying to avoid surprises, be open to surprises and exploit them. Look for them. Actually, actively look for them. Um, and maybe the most surprising or interesting thing of all, rather than finding opportunities, make opportunities. So actually proactively make things. So if we really want to internalize this, yeah, maybe we do have to start thinking, well, we're not just an advisory role. Maybe it's also more about encouraging our business stakeholders to think this way as well. Um, I know there's one person here who was at my talk at the BA conference 11 years ago, because that was Adrian. And there I talked about this idea of Gareth Morgan, strategic termites. Gareth Morgan is another fantastic business writer from the 1980s. He wrote some absolutely brilliant books. And he talked about termites. So these are termite nests in the picture. Termites are these horrible little blind creatures that will eat the foundations of your house if you're not careful. But they build these incredible houses for themselves. I don't know exactly how tall these are, but if a human being was to build something that was proportionately this tall, it would be over a mile tall. So it's quite impressive. And how do they do it? Well, they just scurry around making little piles of soil. Each termite just makes a little pile here, a little pile over there, and they just keep going. They just keep going. They keep adding to another little pile of soil, and they build and they build and they build, and the nest gets higher and higher and higher. And when it gets to the point where two of them are very close to each other, they sort of join them together at a strategic point. And that's it. That's how they build these buildings. Uh, effectively they just make it up as they go along on the basis of where they've got to at this point. So this is a different way of doing strategy. It's not what we're taught, is it? It's the opposite of what we're taught. You won't find this in any of the BA textbooks, but it is how successful entrepreneurs operate. Um, and because I'm busy talking, I'm not really keeping an eye on the chat, I'm afraid. But I did see one word that Adrian put in there, which is this one, Kenevin. Um, so yeah, some other people will have come across Kenevin as well. This is Dave Snowden's framework, which he's been evolving for many years, and it's basically based on the idea of having four different types of decision-making environment. Um, you could be in a clear situation where there's only a few variables at play. It's clear how they interact, so you can understand it, you can predict the future. So what you've got to do in that situation is just categorize what you can see and respond to it. Um, if it's a complicated situation, there are far more variables at play, and it's not immediately obvious how they interact with each other. So you've got to analyze it. You've got to figure it out. You've got to, sense, analyze, and respond. Um, a complex situation is where, however much analysis you do, you're not going to be able to figure it out without trying something out. So you've got to probe the situation. You've got to try out a few things to test out your hypotheses as to what's going on. And then sometimes you're in a chaotic situation, really, where you've got no idea what's going on, and the only way you can intervene successfully in this situation is to do something. And maybe doing something will enable you to get a handle on what's going on. Um, so, um, Sarasvati and Dave Snowden with Kinevin and Gareth Morgan with his termites, they're all saying something similar. Um, this is what I take from it. Uh, you have to keep moving forwards in any situation as an organization. You have to keep moving forwards, and you need to have clear principles. You need to have clear principles, and you need to have a clear long-term vision. But what you don't want to have is a cast in stone medium term plan. You want to avoid having a very fixed medium term plan because it's going to need to change. Um, and one interesting thing to me is that some I've heard people say a lot, business analysts are there to provide clarity, and I like that. That's a nice way of thinking about what we do as business analysts. Um, but does that mean we should encourage the stakeholders to persist in a simplified view of what's going on when that's not actually right? Um, or should we be the specialists in thinking in a slightly more sophisticated way, maybe, than one of our stakeholders might take for granted? Should we be the people that say, okay, that could be the plan, but maybe this could also be the plan as well? Um, because you can have multiple plans simultaneously. If you think back to the branching pattern that I talked about earlier. Um, and the final thing is your organization is ambiguous. You know, if we come back to the this idea of an ideal state, I just want to show you another variation on that diagram. This is from someone that not many people have come across, a guy called Bill Barnati, who is often credited with having invented the double diamond model that a lot of people think that the Design Council invented. Well, they didn't. Bill Barnati wrote about it a long time before they did. Um, and in order to design your to be state, according to his model, you need to start off with the current state. And then you've got to say, okay, on the basis of our current state, let's try and imagine several possible imagined states and then work backwards from the imagined state to the to be state. But you don't necessarily have to pick one and commit to it. You want to keep your options open. And again, this is one of the great ideas in Agile, the idea of the last responsible moment. You want to defer making a decision until it's more advantageous to make it than it is not to make it. But very often it's more advantageous to keep your options open. Um, and what this kind of brings me on to uh, is um, is of course soft systems methodology and Peter Sheckland. I know Adrian will not mind me bringing Peter Sheckland up um, because when we talk about idealized design and a desired to be state or an ideal state, um, Peter Sheckland, the inventor of soft systems methodology, talks about ideal models as well. But what he meant by an ideal model is literally a model that's made up of ideas. So this is the example on this slide is what in the BCS book is referred to as a business activity model. But Checklin called them, he had various names for them, but he called them conceptual models and human activity system models and so on. But the whole point in his version, the original version of soft systems methodology, is that you should come up with multiple conceptual models of your business. In the BCS version, we have this idea of a consensus BAM, but that is nowhere to be found in Sheckland's work. On the contrary, the whole point of the conceptual models in Sheckland's work is that they help you to see the situation from different perspectives and to follow through the implications of those different perspectives by teasing out, well, what would the implication of those thinking about it that way be? And if we can hold on to that way of thinking, that ambiguous way of thinking and be prepared to, keep in our mind simultaneously multiple different versions of the truth, will be doing the organization a favor. So I've just put an extra point at the end here. Remember, your organization is ambiguous and never ignore that ambiguity. Although your stakeholders would like to, and they would like you to, don't ignore it, seek it out, embrace it, and wrestle with it. because that ambiguity is the grit in the oyster that makes the pearl, and it's that process of wrestling with the ambiguity that really gets you to a good result. So that's what I would sort of challenge you to do as a business analyst. Try to help your stakeholders to think in a more flexible way. Um, yeah, and I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. I know I haven't left very long uh, for talking about points that people have raised, but Adrian, maybe you'd like to serve me up some
Yeah, yeah.
examples.
Well, first of all, thank you. I think it's definitely time for a virtual round of applause for Nick for a very thought-provoking session there. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned Checkland. Of course, you know that I would always advocate advocate for some Checklanding in every presentation. Um, so we do have a few questions. We'll cover as many as we can. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. Just before you do that, I'm just going to put Nick's LinkedIn address in the chat if you'd like to connect with Nick. And also, although it's a different topic, Nick's book around user experience foundations, which you'll definitely want to check out as well. Um, but our first question is an anonymous question, and the question is, how do you get the customer to agree to participate in appreciative inquiry, as a lot are focused on the problem and it could be perceived as a waste of time?
Yes, yes, well, absolutely. I think with a lot of techniques like this, the answer is to do it by stealth. So not use big words like appreciative inquiry. Just weave those questions into the conversations that you're having anyway. Really, I think that's the short answer.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things have to be done by stealth, don't they, in the real world? I see Karen's just put stealth is always the way in the comments. So, um, and actually, the next question also comes from Karen, and I think this was typed around the time we were talking about the different types of complexity and then Cynefin. So Karen asks, how do you identify the type of complexity? Is it even possible?
Ooh. Well, I don't know. I think there's just a matter of judgment, and you have to. I think the key thing is being aware that there are these different types of situation. Once you've got that framework in your head, ever since I first came across it, maybe sort of 15 years ago, it's not it's never gone out of my head, and it's a set of categories that you can always be comparing things against. That doesn't mean there is necessarily a definitive answer about what is the right category to put your situation in, because you can always look at situations in different ways.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting as you were talking through. I mean, I had this weird analogy growing in my head as you've been talking, Nick, about like captain and co-pilot on a flight deck, and sort of, having a vector that they're planning to go on, but actually, and a destination that they originally thought they're going to go in, but potentially, I guess if it's a private plane and the people in the back change their mind on where they're wanting to go, then they might need to go off of that, or some situations might change externally, like weather on their weather radar, and they're like, well, we can't, we've got to choose a different vector. Um, and and anyway, this is a really geeky thing, but I saw a documentary a while back about a famous near disaster where, I don't know, in the cockpit all the warning lights were coming on, and the captain, it was on the voice recorder, and it's attributed to him basically saving the plane, said, yeah, but what is working? Like, what systems do I have? And managed to, against all the odds, land the plane. That kind of reminded me a little bit of appreciative inquiry about, what's going well here. So anyway, that's a slight aside.
Right.
Let, we've probably got time for one more question. So our next question is an anonymous question, but it says, given increasing organizational complexity, do you think future BAs will be valued more for simplifying information or for helping teams think through ambiguity?
Well, I think it's got to be thinking through ambiguity. That a smart organization, that's what they're going to value, and that's the message from this talk, really. In the short term, very often you'll find yourself in a situation or a context where people prefer clarity, they prefer simplicity, but that's not always the right way to go, not necessarily.
Yeah, yeah. Karen's put in the chat, I wonder if you always have to assume more complexity than you are being told there is. And in my experience, that's usually the case. I don't know if that's universal, but
Definitely.
so,
Definitely, you have Russian dolls, don't you? You have complexity within complexity. Just when you think you've understood everything and it's all really simple, you fall down another rabbit hole and you're in another whole world of complexity.
absolutely. And what a wonderful place to end with another Alice in Wonderland analogy. So, excellent. Well, if we didn't get to your question, I apologise. I think we've got one or two left that we couldn't get to. But so again, thank you very much, Nick, for taking the time to be here. I know that that's people are going to really have got a lot from this. How's the best way for people to stay in touch with you? Is it to connect on LinkedIn or?
LinkedIn, definitely. Yes, I'm on Blue Sky as well. If anyone's on Blue Sky, if anyone's still on Twitter, please don't.
Yes,
Please
yeah, best
close
to
your
leave.
Twitter account and move over to Blue Sky. But yeah, LinkedIn is great.
So fantastic. All that's left for me to say is again, thank you, Nick. Thank you for everyone who attended live or indeed is watching the recording. And look forward to seeing you again soon. So bye for now. Enjoy the rest of your day.